Welcome to Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers across the arts, sciences, business, sports, and the world of social impact. This show is brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business serving the community since 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. Today's guest is Erika Funke, a beloved broadcaster who has spent nearly 5 decades covering the arts in Northeast Pennsylvania, primarily in her home communities of Luzerne and Lackawanna counties, the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area. Erika is the voice behind public radio station WVIA's daily program, ArtScene, as well as its regional series, Keystone Edition Arts. Recently inducted into the Luzerne County Arts and Entertainment Hall of Fame, Erika's impressive career also includes narrating a television documentary on the Knox Mine Disaster, writing and performing a radio play titled Who Pretender Is or Who is King, and serving on the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. Erika was also the creative force and tour guide behind an Emmy-nominated documentary on Mozart that looks at the composer and his music in the context of the cities that were important in his life. In addition to her extensive radio work, Erika shares her love for classical music as co-host of WVIA's Classical Music Show with Lisa Mazzarella. Harmony Talk is excited to announce our recent partnership with WVIA, where you can now catch the podcast Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Erika, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Welcome, Lisa, and thank you always for such a lovely, lovely introduction. And the tables are turned because I spend all those years interviewing others and not being interviewed.
Absolutely. You're on the hot seat today.
Thank you for asking me to join you in this way.
And this is a show, as you know, about dreamers and doers. You grew up in the Wilkes-Barre area and you went to the University of Chicago, where I believe your passion for art as something that could, and I'm quoting you, help us grow and change hearts was ignited. You have somewhat jokingly referred to your name, Funke, as being so hip you had to go into broadcasting. But it really was a novelist and a brilliant conductor that catapulted you into your field. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, yes. And really they were those scales falling from your eyes or your ears moments. There was a sense when I was young, I was immersed in the arts, but I was trying to find out what it meant to be alive in our time and how you make a decision and how you can act, how you can do that. And I mean, it sounds very grand, but those were the stumbling ways. And one of the first and the most eye-scale dropping moments was reading in school the novella that we know from Francis Ford Coppola, The One Apocalypse Now, but it was Joseph Conrad and The Heart of Darkness. And because I had a wonderful prof and everything was falling into place, I could see how a novel worked, how a poem worked suddenly, that you could have an understanding of the world and give it shape and form, and then put it out into the world, and then others could interact with that and on their own, maybe not with you directly, but have a conversation, and that conversation could continue about what it means to be alive in our time or just in general. So that was one thing. So that was our art book that they said, oh, yes, I can see that now.
Well, that's very interesting because The Heart of Darkness is a dark book, which of course is about a man searching for another man. But it became Apocalypse Now in Francis Ford Coppola's mind, which was transposed to Vietnam. So how did you turn that into something so positive? I mean, it was really a dark story, brilliant story, brilliant.
And that was also exciting to me, was the horror that becomes kind of a byword or by phrase in that. I just didn't buy that. I didn't buy the fact that if Kurtz is going to survive in the world and just put himself in the work, and that was going to be the way to get through. I just didn't think that made any sense in my young experience, even. The people I knew, that again, it was just a sense that, no, don't clamp down. It's not that we're not going to spill out and spew out all this horror, that there has to be another way. And so that set me off on the other way, which led to your second part of your question, which was the conductor. And I was in Chicago, and happily there were all kinds of artistic opportunities, including the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And Sir Joe Schulte was still alive then. And he led a performance one time. I don't even remember what else was on the program, but it was Beethoven's Symphony No. 7. And it was one of those moments when the orchestra was completely together. He was guiding them in a way with the pace that wasn't too furious, because that's the one that they talk about, the dance, and you just go, woo, woo, woo,
Right.
catapulting to the end of the thing where you're out of breath. But it just seemed to be, they were on a roll, but in a controlled way. But that passion was strong and there was a tension there. And at the end, we know how audiences are, don't we, Lisa, where you get to the almost the last note and then everybody yells and screams, and you can't hear the trailing off. And that was a moment when the audience, and it was, again, I was still young, I didn't know so much, but there was silence at the end. And of course, then everybody, clapped and stood. But it was the sense that we had just experienced something together that was profound. And it may sound like cliches, but that it touched us, and in a way that we all were hushed and just, oh, what did we just experience? And my sense was that we experienced a journey with Beethoven and each other that took us to places where we don't usually go, a sense of depth, and where our hearts, or, I'm going to use the word soul because I believe in some sense that we have souls, and that we all resonated together, and people got up after it was over and looked at each other, strangers, and said, wow. And you're nice enough to ask the question, Lisa. That was when I said, oh, if that's what music can do, then I want to somehow make music available to other people, because if we can all go to that place sometimes we might be more humane.
I was also struck by the fact that that particular piece, Beethoven, which has been done many times over, the individualism of the conductor, it was his impact. So the artist is very important, in addition to the piece being so helping us be more humane.
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right. And who knows what his experiences were before he came to the States, and what he experienced in Europe and his home, and all that. By that point in his career, he must have experienced not just the great conductors of Europe he was exposed to, and the great music and the great teachers, perhaps, then working with the Chicago Symphony and those great musicians, but his life experience, feeding into that, and knowing, no doubt, what the tragedies of Beethoven, going deaf, and his ideals about liberté, égalité, fraternité, and the crestfallen nature of the disappointment with Napoleon when he declared himself emperor, all those things that make Beethoven's music so rich. And then I think you're absolutely right, Lisa, you have an artist who somehow can feel that or understand that. And it's not just the notes and racing and getting the tempo right. There's something there that resonated, I believe.
You, of course, coming into the present day, you interview, of course, a lot of artists, and you're known for your soothing voice. But audience, please make no mistake, this woman is very knowledgeable and particularly deft at drawing out guests on ArtScene. How do you choose your guests? How do you find them? I mean, it's a daily show, which is quite a grind. So just tell us about the process.
It's double. We get many requests. And as you probably realize, Lisa, we do extend up to Wayne County and the northern counties, and even a little bit into Binghamton, down into the Lehigh Valley with the translators that we have into the Susquehanna Valley. And so one of the considerations is, let's cover the area and make sure that we don't just become Wilkes-Barre Scranton centric. Then, of course, the different genres. We want to make sure we cover dance. We want, all in a balanced way, what's out there. And we also want to do things that are related to events, concerts, but also authors, for example, and just take the time to say, oh, Andrew Krivak, you're from the back mountain outside Wilkes-Barre, and you've written a novel that is based there, but the names are different. And what does it mean for you to write out of that place? And I'm always concerned about place and the arts, and particularly in writing. So it's somebody has a wonderful new book. It doesn't have to be about place, but they're tied to this area. They don't have to be from this area, but some sort of tie. Because I also think that what we are to do with these interviews is to help our region know something about where we might have come from in terms of the history, what the struggles might have been, even if listeners moved into the area, should know what might have been the shaping forces before those people got to the area and started living here. And that's a long way of saying, if I can find any or all of those things, those are great. But then there's also, at this time of year, we're talking in holiday time, it's the busiest time. So people need to have their nutcrackers talked about and their Christmas carols and their special Hanukkah programs talked about and Diwali. That's also telling who we are here as a mix of people. So I hate to say no. And I always try to, yes, well, let's see if we can do that. We squeeze it in there.
Right. That's the difficult part, or one of the difficult parts. Absolutely. Well, I listened to a recent interview you did with Michael Mirabito, who's a protest photographer. He photographs protests. And the pianist Cody Mead from the Bloomsburg Singers. You interview, obviously, artists, producers, writers, a slew of people from all over the art world. So I'm not going to ask you for a favorite, but perhaps a few stand out, a few memorable ones. Could you just give us maybe some that you kind of remember?
Well, I will. I mentioned Andrew Krivak because that was one of the ones that I was really choked up at the end, and he was too. I really actually got up and walked outside the building because it was so moving. He was so sensitive to what he experienced growing up in our area. And he loved his mother and his father, and he went to a great book school, St. John's in Annapolis, Maryland. And so he'd read a lot. But there was nothing in the conversation that was, I've read Dostoevsky or anything like that. It was just that he was so meditative and thoughtful about the struggles that he had in making sense of who he was, what he might be doing with his life, how he came to write, and that he could frame those questions in terms of coming from here. And I thought that was really very important for us because, again, it leads into what I just said about the place and who we are. So that was one of them that was most moving. But I have had a conversation, and I don't so enjoy the famous people that we have a chance to talk to. It's wonderful always, but I always think that they are used to being interviewed, and not that they're on automatic pilot, because I always try to find ways into talking to them about what they are, about that's deeper and that might reflect on our area. Colin Whitehead, who is the novelist of the Underground Railroad and a number of books, was a tough interview. It felt like he was rushed, but he also came around to listening to when he was coming to speak in Scranton. He might have helped him understand his audience as he was addressing when he was in Scranton, if he knew that underneath the Scranton Cultural Center or there around, there were actually tunnels with railroads. And so that was a nice exchange. But the one that was perhaps the most phenomenal in terms of difficult interviews, but in the end marvelous, was Jack Palance, the actor, who was the one who did the push-ups on the Oscar stage when he got for City Slickers, I think it was, he got the award finally. And the tough guy and the bad guys in all those movies. Well, he's from the Latimer Mines just outside Hazleton, and he's always kept his tie there. He had a farm there, and his family, he would come back and not forget them. Well, he's also a painter. So he came back, and the Everhart Museum in Scranton was hosting an exhibition of his paintings. And that was a surprise to many people that Jack Palance, the actor, the tough guy, actually painted. And he painted landscapes and he wrote poems, and the poems would be on the back of the paintings. And so he went on the tour, his people taking care of him, took him to all the TV stations and all of that and the newspapers. And WVIA was the last stop on the trip of the publicity. Well, he was tired. He was exhausted. He didn't want to answer any questions. We went back to the studio and he sat. The body language was he turned his shoulder and then side to me and dive. Just don't go, let's get this over. So I asked some questions that I know not to ask yes and no. You know that, Lisa. You don't ask yes and no questions.
Except for politicians. Just kidding.
Oh, okay. There you go. You're right. You're absolutely right. That's funny.
So what did you do? How did you get the information?
I was so frustrated. So where can we see it? How can we, that kind of wrap up. But I had noticed when he was turning away from me, he was looking at the CDs on the shelf right next to the table where we were. And it happened to be the M's for Mozart. So I thought, should I ask him why he's looking at Mozart so intently, or those CDs? Okay, I don't have anything to lose. Do you like classical music? Do you listen to music at all when you paint, for example? Well, he swung around in the chair. He pulled himself up to his 6 foot whatever. And he said, oh, do I love music? Do I love Mozart? The best opera in the world. Oh, Don Giovanni. There's no better opera than Don Giovanni. Well, that was off. We were off and running about how he was touched by music. So that was probably the most astounding interview.
You know, I had the privilege of being present when you interviewed Anna Quindlen in person for her book, After Annie. The setting was a fundraiser for WVIA in the historic Stegmeyer Mansion in Wilkes-Barre. Again, your style is so warm, inviting, and educated all at once. And this was really about Anna Quindlen, but it was also about the future of public radio and public television. What do you remember of that interview?
Well, I remember that I thought that she is one of those persons who is interviewed all the time. That not that she doesn't do interviews, but that she's interviewed all the time. And yet I felt that she was present there and that she listened to the questions and that she answered them with sincerity. And that was something I didn't know what to expect when we get, you read somebody and you think, oh, Anna Quindlen, how wonderful. But I felt and also felt that even though when we were just talking about the book itself, the questions, it all had to do with her love, as you just suggested, of public broadcasting, public media. And she was giving her time, not just another book event, but it was because she believes in the importance in our day and age, particularly public radio and public television. So that was the undercurrent. But then to have her talk, and the book is about mortality and grief and families. And it's all those profound things that we all have to deal with in kitchens and homes and down to earth things. And I thought it was so important. And I could look out and see all of you at the tables and see how rapt everyone was when she was answered. Didn't you feel?
Absolutely. Everyone was listening. You could hear the proverbial pin drop.
Yes. And I felt so privileged to have been able to do that, to sit next to her and to do that. And I wanted to ask her and I didn't because I didn't want to put her on the spot. But the opening sentence has 5 words in it. And it is just like the words that open A Christmas Carol. Marley was dead. There was no doubt about it. Well, that's how the book opens. And then I discovered that she did her dissertation on Dickens. So it may have been that she was playing around with that, but it wasn't the place to go there. If it had been an ArtScene interview, we would have done that. I bet that was that she was just toying with those.
Maybe a second interview is in the works somewhere. Well, let's talk for a second about something you brought up many, many times, which is place and history and the local region. So your documentary on the Knox Mine Disaster, which virtually ended coal mining as a business in Northeast Pennsylvania, and your play, Who Pretender Is or Who is King, they're both about coal mining. The play focuses on residents plagued by a chronic mine fire. The title itself is intriguing, Who Pretender Is or Who is King. What does it refer to? And why don't you tell us a little bit about these productions?
Well, again, privileges, and they're both different. One's a documentary and one's a creative project. But the Knox Disaster film, it was 25 years after the event in the Wyoming Valley when the water from the Susquehanna River during the January thaw broke through the workings of the Knox Coal Company and killed 12 miners and 36 got out. And it was really, as you suggested, for all intents and purposes, because the water went down, the mines were all connected and the water went from one to the next. But it was this astonishing image that grabbed the world, actually. It was a vortex that was absolutely enormous. It's like when we see a hurricane from above the eye and it wouldn't stop. All the water of the river kept going down and down. And they had these huge, huge train cars and gondolas trying to throw everything in, Excelsior, and straw. And eventually they were able to stop it up, but it was billions, not just millions, but I think billions of gallons. So it was an extraordinary, and WVIA felt it couldn't and shouldn't let the 25th anniversary go by without acknowledging that very important point. So the video crew who was producing it just came knocking on the radio door and said, Erika, can you help us? Here's what we want to do, and we want to do it soon. And so it was one of those, oh, okay, poring over newspapers and writing the narration. And then their narrator, I have to say, honestly, their narrator was late for the gig. And so they asked me if I would narrate it, but it was important because people needed to know that, know the facts, but also get that sense of the larger than life, like the metaphor that that vortex represented, as you suggested, because it was almost as if an era was being pulled down.
Absolutely. Well, also, I mean, visually, yes, that was an incredible, incredible series of pictures, but also the story behind it with the labor unions and the mine owners and the corruption. I mean, it was epic, really epic. But tell us about the creative piece. Who is pretender and who is king, or who is king?
Yes, that had to do with my growing up I grew up in downtown Wilkes-Barre, and we had a half of a house that had 3 stories and a flat roof on the 3rd floor. And I used to crawl out through the window and sit on the flat roof and look off to the mountain where the community of Laurel Run was. And at that time, the mine fire that was plaguing the community was really very active, and nothing had been done to quench it.
Excuse me, it was in Wilkes-Barre itself?
No, well, up on the mountain outside Wilkes-Barre, Georgetown, and up in Laurel Run. So it was you could go up Northampton Street in Wilkes-Barre, up a mountain, and there you were. So it wasn't in downtown Wilkes-Barre, no, but it was connected to mines in Wilkes-Barre too. And so when I was little, I used to imagine that was a dragon. I don't know why, but with the smoke. And so I really did have a sense that, oh, there's a fairy tale thing going on up there. And then my dad, after, would take me to church on Sundays, and then we'd go for a drive, as families used to do in those days. And he often liked to go up to Laurel Run because the vista, the view of the Wyoming Valley, almost up to Lackawanna County, was tremendous. But it was crazy because in the winter, snow wouldn't be sticking there because of the heat of the mine fire. And so there'd be mosses, and the steam would be coming out of the holes that were there in the community, and it would smell sulfur. So having just heard a hellfire and damnation sermon, I thought, oh, well, that's what that is. That's where you go if you're, that's what that is.
Oh my goodness, I'm going to hell.
Yeah, exactly right.
Excuse the language, but I think that's what you meant.
No, it's true. The whole place captured my imagination. And Laurel Run was the first community that was bulldozed, and the people were relocated under the Redevelopment Act from Congress. We had a very powerful Congressman, Dan Flood, and he wanted to make sure that those people were safe because ducks were dying, chickens were dying, people were in the homes that were there in that community. People slept in the winter with the windows open and in their sweaters and coats and hats and gloves, but they loved their community because they loved the view, they loved the people.
Well, I think there are still people in Centralia, which has the underground mine fire, who refuse to leave for that very reason. But I'm glad that they were able to contain or quell the fire that you mentioned near Wilkes-Barre. So where did the title come from?
Well, it's a title from a piece in a poem, in an English poem. And what struck me about it was that the coal was, at the era of the coal, as we were talking about with the end of the era there, that gas and oil were the pretenders to the throne of King Coal. So that's what I was thinking of. And it isn't thematically, the title doesn't come up, but the idea, the thematically, that coal is being overthrown and what are the consequences for people.
Wow. And so have you written anything creative since then?
Well, something completely different. I love pottery, and it's just a hobby. And I had a wonderful mentor named MC Richards, who was a poet and a potter, and she actually taught English at the University of Chicago before I was there, but she also wound up with the folks at Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina, which was the center of that arts and education there. And the emigres from the war and fleeing Germany came, Joseph Albers and Annie Albers, the artists there, and Merce Cunningham and Franz Klein from here wound up there for a while in the summers. Bucky Fuller, she was there. She's a wonderful, wonderful person. And so I spent a summer with her at Goddard College in Vermont when I was doing some graduate work. And I was just, again, she was a mentor who just opened the world of creative. What does it mean? What's the creative process all about? And the riches beyond measure. When I came back and got the job at WVIA, it turned out that she was spending a couple of years in a farm in Susquehanna County with another wonderful potter named Paulus Berenson, and she would listen to me on the radio, and we had a request program. So she would, once in a while, she never abused the privilege, but once in a while she'd call. She liked the Schubert Quintet in C major, and she also asked for the songs of Mary of Hindemith. And I always wondered about that. I wondered why. They were Rilke poems, German poems, and she would told me that she would be sitting in her studio and making pots to these things. So I wondered, I always was curious about that. I never got to ask her. So she died at a wonderful, ripe age, beautiful age. And Black Mountain had a commemorative event at her 100th birthday. So I went to that, and I was able to see where she worked and see some of her work that they had and so on. So I was inspired more to just pay tribute to her. So they had a contest for an audio piece through the Black Mountain College Museum of Art and asked for a 5-minute piece, creative piece on anything. So I thought I would explore and see if I could find out for myself what that Marian leader was all about with her. So I created a 5-minute piece, and it was, a winner. So that's what I did.
What was the title of the piece?
Her name was Mary Carolyn Richards. So it was Mary Carolyn's songs rather than Marian Laban leader by Hindemith. So it was just using her name instead of the title of the Hindemith piece.
Well, that sounds wonderful. A real tribute to her as well. So circling back, would you say that historically you have found that art does change hearts?
First-hand experience, I would say clearly. But, we're in a position here when you and I do interviews, we're in a position to talk with people and, as you do, give people time. And it's not just the arts, because you talk with all kinds of people. But if you talk with people for enough time and learn their stories and really listen, for me, that's the key, really listening deeply, even between the lines. And you know about that too. Listening, I would say that many times that individuals would tell a story, and then I saw Shakespeare and I was never the same. Or then I heard a song that George Graham played and I was in tears and I was never the same. We hear that all the time. So I do think it can break through in that way. But also I care, and you do too, we care about the place where we live and the communities in which we live. And I was able, when I was doing the graduate work that I did, to do a study on the community arts of Harrisburg. And I was able to track through interviews and reports in newspapers and putting it together with theories and so forth, interviews with academics and so forth, and the data that really there was, after a flood that maybe it was the 72 flood and Harrisburg had a setback, but it was really so many people explain that the arts that came back helped people regain their sea legs. Again, not quantifiable exactly, but it had to do with a lot of the founding of groups, and then the granting and the foundations maybe pulled back, and so it wasn't as strong. But there was an example. I was trying to make the case, and I think, you could consider it, that was a community that was impacted by the arts, and it was at a time when it was needed. It was diverse. There was a diverse population, a diverse number of people who were producing the arts, different ethnicities and racial backgrounds coming together and making art together in different ways, in a kind of not a joint venture, but it was little individual pockets that seemed to have an impact.
This is kind of a springboard to part 2 of our interview to talk about the future of the arts today. But because we're ending on such a hopeful note, we're going to end there, and maybe we can have you back on the show again. Erika, I was so glad to have met you and spoken to you, and I'm very happy to be part of the WVIA family that is HarmonyTALK. So thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you, and we are so pleased to have you because, again, we love those intelligent conversations that go deeper than just the surface and help us understand who we are as folks and people and neighbors and the like, and have local, regional, and worldwide implications. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. That's high praise coming from you, Erika. I really appreciate it. This podcast has been brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. Thanks for being with us. Talk to you next time.